Welcome to Basic Brewing Radio for Thursday, July 17th, 2008. I'm James Spencer. Here at Basic Brewing Radio, we're all about home brewing. Well, this week we wrap up our coverage of the National Homebrewers Conference in Cincinnati with an interview with Randy Mosher, author of Radical Brewing. Randy talks with us about his topic for the conference, the Belgium nobody knows. Well, if you're new to home brewing and would like to get into the hobby for the first time, check out our website, basicbrewing.com, where you can find archives of our audio and video podcasts and our DVDs to walk you through basic and more advanced brewing techniques. And you can follow me on Twitter. My username is Basic Brewing, all one word. Well, this week marks the third anniversary of Basic Brewing Radio. Yay! Hard to believe. It was way back on July 14th, 2005, that I posted the very first episode, one of three discussions with my buddy Andy Sparks in the storeroom of Andy's shop, thehomebrewery.com. And I have to be honest with you, at that time I thought, well, you know, we may be able to stretch this out to like 10 episodes or so before we start running out of things to talk about. But this one, according to my calculations, is episode 151. So there you go. When we run out of things to say, I'll let you know. I appreciate everybody who's hung with us and supported us the past 3 years, and I'm looking forward to year 4. So let's get it underway, shall we? It's been a long time since I've dipped into the mailbag, and I have been answering the email, but I just haven't been reading it on the show. So remember, if you don't hear back from me, your response may be in your junk email box, or your message may occasionally be in mine. I try to clean mine out as much as I can, and it's not perfect, so sometimes things may get lost. But alternately, you may have misspelled your email address on the online form, so be careful of that. I catch that every now and then, and sometimes I can fix them. Other times I can't. The first note this week is from Spencer from Ann Arbor, Michigan. Spencer writes, I did my first all-grain this last weekend, a Northern English brown ale, and it went pretty smooth. Congratulations, Spencer. I pitched the yeast at high kreuzen at a good rate, according to the Mr. Malty calculator. That's Jamil Zainashev's calculator on MrMalty.com. So there was no lag, Spencer says. I used a blow-off tube and fermented at 68 degrees Fahrenheit. I left for the weekend and came back, and there was blow-off everywhere. This overflowed from my catch jar and onto the floor, quite a mess. The starting gravity was only 1044, so my question is, do all-grain batches have a more vigorous blow-off than extract batches? Well, Spencer, no, not in my experience. I think I've said this before on the show, but most of the time, when I have overflowing fermenter issues, I've brewed with a good amount of wheat. For some reason, the wheat likes to crawl out of the fermenter. For instance, my Belgian brunette had a bunch of wheat in it, and it, sure enough, I found it clogging the airlock in the carboy the next day, and I had to take some measures before the carboy blew up. But, most of my beers behave themselves and stay inside the carboy, whether they're all grain or not. So nothing to worry about there necessarily, Spencer. Congratulations on your first all-grain batch. That's terrific. Incidentally, if you're going to use a blow-off tube, I'd recommend something bigger than a standard quarter-inch vinyl tube. In my opinion, those things can get clogged, too. And my local homebrew shop sells a tube that's big enough to fit just inside the mouth of the carboy, so that there's less of a chance of clogging, theoretically. However, I'd still check from time to time, if you do have a blow-off tube, no matter how big it is, to make sure that there are no clogs and that the pressure isn't building up inside your carboy, because I've gotten letters from people who, their carboys have disappeared while they were gone, and beer and shards of glass were everywhere inside their bathroom or closet or wherever the carboy used to be. So something to be serious about. Joseph from Melbourne writes, I currently have a Belgian triple in the fermenter, original gravity 1080. I was going to put some into secondary and bottle some straight out of the fermenter. Do you think it's necessary to pitch fresh yeast when bottling? Well, not necessarily, but you'd get a quicker carbonation in your bottle if you bottle condition if you pitch fresh yeast. At 1080, it's a pretty big beer, and the yeast is probably pretty tired from the fermentation. You'd probably still get adequate carbonation without repitching yeast at bottling time, but if you're impatient like me, it wouldn't hurt to repitch. I've done big beers, like triples and such, similar beers, and they take a while to get up to the carbonation level that I like, without repitching some fresh yeast in there. And you don't have to pitch the same yeast that you brewed with. You can pitch like a good, like Saf Ale 1056 or something. It doesn't have to be the same characters as what you fermented with. Dave from Burlington, Wisconsin writes, can you poll your listeners if anyone has experience with the grain mill attachment for KitchenAid mixers? Amongst the product literature and whatnot online, there is coarse to fine adjustment. I'm curious if someone has used it and can confirm if there are coarse enough settings to be used in all grain without getting a stuck mash or making dough, which is not good. You do have dough in, but you don't want to make actual dough. Dave says it isn't any cheaper than mills sold in homebrew shops, but it might be less scrutinized or criticized by the Frau. Always important to keep the wife happy, and anytime you can sneak in a homebrew purchase under the guise of a kitchen purchase, it's probably good. But I've read a bit about the KitchenAid grain mill attachment in forums and such, and from what I've read, I think you'd be better off getting a grain mill designed for brewing. Milling your grain is such an important step, and I'm assuming that the KitchenAid attachment isn't cheap, so if you got it and weren't happy with it, then you'd risk being grumpy all the time, and, that wouldn't sit well with your wife either. So you're protecting her by buying the brewing grain mill, you see. It's still about the wife. If brewing good beer with a good grain mill makes you happy, then she's going to be happier than if you bought something that was inferior for that purpose and were grumpy. See how this works? So get the dedicated brewing grain mill and make some beer that she likes, and then all is good with the world. But if you do have a KitchenAid grain mill attachment for your mixer, and it does work for you, let me know, and I'll put that out there as well. Tim from Seattle, Washington writes, I've taken to referring to the podcast as Mr. Spencer's Homebrewing Neighborhood. Steve and Andy's voices are the familiar show-in, show-out people, and occasional guests like John Palmer, Chris Colby, etc., are like the other characters in that other neighborhood show. And Tim says, then I watched a video podcast, and you have a fish tank. Tim says, next time you need to put on a sweater or something and feed the fish. Well, Tim, you can't tell, but I am wearing sneakers, and I have changed out of loafers. So, and there is a giant stoplight hanging off the wall, or on the wall, kind of off camera. So I'm pretty sure that Steve would be Chef Brockett, but what would Andy be? King Friday the 13th? Will Andy be King Friday? That was the only character. He was a puppet, but he was the only character with a beard on the Mr. Rogers show. So I don't know. We just need a Lady Aberlin to come over every now and then, especially if she could wear those go-go boots that Lady Aberlin used to wear. Phew. Oh, and by the way, the fish are my wife's fish, so I'll not be feeding them. She has she's got a whole balanced ecosystem thing going in there where the ammonia's right and all the boy. If she thinks I'm geeky about the beer, whew. Okay, enough rambling for me. It's time to get on with the show. It's a lot of fun to talk to Randy Mosher. Always. He's a walking encyclopedia of beer knowledge from a practical, historical, and a cultural perspective. And Randy gave a presentation in Cincinnati based on a rare Belgian brewing book that he found. And he gave recipes to home brewers, and he brewed one himself. And those at the conference who were lucky enough to sit, close to the front because they ran out of some of them, we were able to sample six of these rare old Belgian beer styles based on the descriptions in this book. And they were really incredible beers. I don't know about incredible. Some of them were incredible. All of them were interesting, and some were wonderful. Some used flowers and spices, and they were really kind of refreshing and interesting. So it was a real pleasure to try them, and that's one of the things that I liked about the Homebrewing Conference. You can always find some different stuff to try. So a day or so before his presentation, Steve Wilkes and I took a half an hour of Randy's time to talk about what Randy found in his research.
My presentation is called "The Belgium Nobody Knows," and you could subtitle that "The La Cambre Project."
Okay, I like that.
We don't have T-shirts yet, but who knows?
So Randy Mosher, tell us about this. This book that you found.
Well, as many good stories start, I was browsing eBay one day, and
I've heard that before.
Oh yeah, many people have gone terribly wrong doing that. But so I browsed the old book section to see what I can find, and there all of a sudden popped up a book, a 2-volume brewing and distilling set published in Brussels in 1851 by a guy named G. La Cambre, and I just kind of had to have it. Because it was 900 or 1,000 pages of information on brewing and distilling in an era which we know very little about. Honestly, there's not much been published, certainly not in the homebrew or professional brewing literature recently, certainly not in English. And so I had to purchase it and got it home and started trying to untangle that rather academic French, and of course brewing terminology in foreign languages is especially prickly to get through. But I started to make sense of it, and then it occurred to me that it might be an interesting collaborative project to present some of that information to people at this Homebrew Conference, and not only just sort of lay the information on people, but actually contact some brewers who are looking to brew interesting beers. And I have connections to the local club here for various reasons, and they know I'm Mr. Wacky Beer, and said, well, let's brew some beer. And so we'll have on Saturday 6 or 8 different types of beers from the 6 or 8 beers of 4 or 5 types from this La Cambre book. Now, the thing is, we all think we know something about Belgium, but when you start going back into Belgian history, you realize that for the most part, the beers, with the exception of Lambic and wit beer, most of the beers that we associate with Belgium, the Abbey triples and the doubles and the strong darks, those beers did not exist at all until the 20th century. And those are really creations of post-World War I. And if you look at the history of Belgium in around 1900, the industry was in a complete state of disarray. Very small, and the English guys said dirty, disorganized, terrible little breweries brewing very, very weak running beers that would be sold to pubs locally, no good quality export beers. And in fact, the tax law was such in Belgium that brewers from Germany and England, because of their advantages of scale, could actually produce and import beer cheaper than Belgian brewers could brew it themselves, high-quality beers, that is. And so that was where they were by 1900. And so you start going back then and looking, and this La Cambre's this treasure trove of probably 20 different styles of beer. Of course, some of them familiar because he talks in quite an amount of detail about wit beer and lambics. And I'm not even going to talk about lambics at all tomorrow because I haven't even, it's like, that's another huge thing to tear into. And we all know about lambic to some extent. I'm sure there'll be some surprises there. But there were a whole bunch of other wheat beers and oat beers and beers even with things like buckwheat and spelt and fava beans, things like that in them. And so you start, I thought it was most important to start pulling some of these really oddball beers out and see if we can get them in the light of day and actually get them in the glass. So it's basically experimental archaeology. It's a technique that scientists use when they're studying ancient beer. They actually go through that process and make the beer and brew it and try and, by the brewing process, or by whatever process it is, whether you're making bread or whatever, there's written record, there's archaeological, physical evidence, but then actually going through the process of trying to do it gives you an idea of, well, what's even possible. And when you're in those conditions working with limited equipment and ingredients, certain things to modernize make no sense at all. Once you put yourself in the position of somebody who's using those, limited to those ingredients and techniques, it all sometimes snaps sharply into focus for you. And so we're hoping that will be the case. And the other thing is, I do a lot of historical work and try and pull old recipes and rebrew them. And the one thing I'm constantly amazed by is that you look at these recipes and you think, 20-hour boil, we're mashing in and throwing away all our enzymes. We're, all these crazy things. You think, no, this is just nuts. And then you brew them, and you taste the beer, and you see how it all works, and you think, those old guys knew a thing or two. So
give us one of the more unusual styles, and kind of dissect it, and walk us through the process that you've asked these homebrewers to go through.
Well, one of the beers is a beer called Diest beer. And Diest is actually a product that's still brewed today in Belgium in some form. Today it's a dark beer of not any. I don't really know exactly how it's brewed today, but I'm pretty sure it's a modern sort of loose reinterpretation. In the 1930s, 40s, 50s, Diest was actually sort of the equivalent of Malta or perhaps an invalid stout, one of those English stouts that was extremely high gravity but poorly attenuated and had a lot of sugar in it. It was viewed as a sort of a easily digested food, an energy source for nursing mothers, and kids drank it, and it kept you healthy, and it sort of had all that vibe. But when you go back to Le Combre's day, those beers were still very thick and lubricious. They had the Diest has about 30% oats in it. Wow. And I think there's some wheat in it as well, and some kilned malt. And that beer was often brewed, as many of these beers were, with the addition. It was boiled in the kettle with the addition of chalk, calcium oxide. And calcium oxide in a kettle was used for the purpose of raising the pH of wort, making the wort more alkaline. And alkaline conditions tends to favor darkening of wort pretty significantly. And so there's a number of these beers that are actually, he describes as brown beers, that start out with pale malt. Now, Le Combre was pretty picky, and he was a modern man for his time, and he actually ran a brewery, a very large-scale brewery that brewed in 150 hectoliter batches, which is about 120 barrels or so. And so pretty, modern small industrial-scale brewery. And he frowned on chalk. He thought, you don't really need chalk. That's old for old stuff. And but I mean, he even introduces one of these old beers and says, I swear to you, you're not going to believe me when I tell you this recipe, but I swear to you it's true, and they actually make beer this way. So here's this guy in 1851 saying, you won't believe how nuts these recipes are. And then, of course, they're modernized. They're just even more ridiculous.
Was he Belgian, or was he French? Or
I don't have any information about him. He was certainly a francophone, French-speaking, because that book is published in French. I don't even know his first name. The initial is G. So, a lot of this old literature is just not on the internet. And so you Google one of the, Diest or Oitzit, and you'd come up with very, very little information. So that's why these books are so valuable, because they're really it's about the only way to find out about some of these things.
I'm curious, in the recipes, like in the Diest recipe, did it have measurements? Did you have any recipe that was what we would call a modern recipe, not just boil some stuff for an hour or boil some stuff?
No, they're very detailed procedures. He gives quantities. He gives hop quantities. He gives most of the beers, the liquid quantities he gives is a ton, T-O-N-N-E, and that varied from 150 to about 210 hectoliters, depending upon your location. Remember, you go back in Europe before modern eras, and everybody had a different bushel, everybody had a different barrel, sometimes there were different pounds. You go back 150 years in Germany or the Low Countries, and you find these weights and measures are just all over the place. It's another one of those little pitfalls of trying to do research. A ton is not a ton, a pound is not a pound. So, and all the grain measurements were typically in dry measures. But some recipes he gives in kilograms, some he gives in pounds. It depends. He had pulled information from different sources, and he seemed to keep him in his original thing. But the brewing procedures are quite detailed. The wit beer, the famous Leuven wit beer, which is, we know Hoegaarden is a more famous town for wit, but Leuven actually nearby was by far the more famous wit beer town up until Pierre Celis revived the Hoegaarden. But That brewing description in the book in French takes something like 12 pages to describe how to do this wit beer. And that's one we had a failure on, trying to brew it. Somebody brewed a batch of that beer, and they had taken care to take the text that I'd provided, that my lousy translation, full of errors and stuff, and they had put it into Excel step by step by step by step, and just broke it down, and then created another document that's like, here's step 1, here's step 2, here's step 3, and then he annotated that with his results. So it's really interesting. That's a great thing about collaborating with people. Most of these homebrewers are very intense about what they do, and so you get really high quality information. So he ended up, after about 7 or 8 hours, with what he described as 5 gallons of wheat jelly, and was sort of unable to get any further because it was unspargeable. It was it was just, he had gelatinized the wheat to a point where it was really he couldn't figure out how to do anything. And that's the pitfalls of trying to deal with old recipes with modern ingredients. We don't know what the protein content of the wheat was that they were using. We don't know, there's so much we don't know. Even with all of his detail, we don't know spicing, for example. He talks about spicing. There's a chapter on spicing, but there's no spice information recipe by recipe. So we're on our own for that. So he does talk about elderflowers as a spice that was used, and we'll have a beer tomorrow that will have elderflowers in it. It's a beer d'orge d'Anvers, which means the barley beer of Antwerp. And of course, at that point in time, he says even the barley beers had oats or wheat in them. So
how do you deal with a mash that's like 30% oats? I mean, what are the steps to deal with that?
Rice hulls. And the basic procedure that's used in a lot of these recipes is a technique called a slime mash. It's SLIJM. Slime is a Dutch word that means silt. Right, so and literally, that's everybody universally described the slime as being like gravy. And what it is that you would mash in the grain, you would mash in your grist with tepid water. And after about 10 minutes, when the grist is fully hydrated, you would either drain it out or use a wicker basket called a stuikmand. And a stuikmand is about a 3-foot high by a foot or so in diameter, coarsely woven wicker basket, and you would jam that down into the mash, and the liquid would run in between the wicker, and take a scoop and scoop that stuff out. And you'd start with 1 or 2, then you'd put 2 or 3 more, and the end of this, you would have 10 or 12 stuikmans jammed down into the wort, and they have all of the brewers, 8 or 10 guys, pressing on the stuikmans to press out all the liquid out of this thing, to scoop it out with scoops and put it into the boil kettle. And then you boil it. Okay, so now you've hydrated your mash, you've solubilized your enzymes and a lot of undigested starch, and now you're boiling it. So you're boiling starch, which is really good because it gelatinizes it and it makes it accessible to the enzymes, but unfortunately at the same time you're actually also killing a good deal of your enzymes. And you're preferentially killing enzymes that are the low temperature beta amylase, which are the enzymes that tend to really make a highly fermentable wort. So you're favoring the type of enzyme that will give you a poorly attenuating wort, that is a wort that ends up with a lot of unfermentable sugars in it. So you end up with sweet beers. Now, if you have a 1025 beer that's would normally ferment to 3% alcohol or 2.5% alcohol, now it's only maybe going to 1.5%, but you have a lot of sugar in it. It's a technique that's used in milds, not in the same way, but they use a very high temperature, high strike temperature in milds to kind of kill the beta amylase and favor the alpha amylase, and you end up with poorly fermentable worts, which is a great thing in a low gravity beer because that sugar gives you flavor even though the total alcohol is low and the total extract is low. Sugar is a fairly powerful, potent tastant, right? So it fills the mouth and gives you some feeling of body, even though it's not really body. But it's just been fascinating looking at all this, and it really gives you perspective on brewing technology as a whole, and certainly on the ingenuity of people in those bygone days to figure this stuff out. So,
no kidding. What I was going to ask about hops. The quality or the intensity of the hops I know is much different today than it was even 50 years ago. So that's
actually true. If you look at the literature going back 200 years on hops, you never find a point in time where people say, "Boy, these new hops are just so much more bitter." Now, modern genetic research on breeding on high alpha hop varieties started just before 1900, apparently. And of course, that was well known. And by that point, they understood the concept of bitterness units and things like that. And I'm not sure exactly when that analytical technique was developed, probably in the 20s or 30s, to analyze bitterness in beer. But they certainly understood, yes, these hops are much more bitter. In the old days, I mean, he was using hops. He specifies them from Alost or Poparinga, or in one beer he specifies American hops, very pungent and full of flavor. So even in 1851, American hops were making their way over into Belgium. Again, they were fairly high, stronger, because those Poparinga hops, those French hops, those are all very, very low. They tend to be related to Saats, is my understanding. Certainly the Streisel Spalt, and some of those are, and 1.5–2% typically. And I think probably there was some difference 150 years ago. Yeah, maybe 1.5–3% was sort of typical, and then 50 years later it maybe was 3, 4, 5, but it's not like an order of magnitude difference. And we do find quite a variation in the amount of hops that were put in beers. The Diest is very lightly hopped. The beer that I brewed, which is called an Uitzet, Uytzet. It's a Dutch word meaning outside, which I haven't quite figured out how that meaning translates. That's another little puzzle we got to work on. But that we used 14 ounces of Tettnang hops for 15 gallons of beer. So a little less than 5 ounces in a 5-gallon batch of about 7 alpha hops, I think. So, fairly bitter. I would guess maybe 50 IBUs or so, just offhand. I forget what it calculated out at. But so quite a range in that.
So do you get an idea from the text whether they knew why they did the steps that they did?
Not so much. And in fact, because he was a modern scientist, and he really a brewing technology guy, he has a large part of the wit beer section where he describes the classic technology of doing it, this long, complicated. It actually ran 2 parallel mashes, one with the wheat and one with the malt, and ended up at the end you had worts that you combined, but they were mashed totally separately all the way down. And then he gives a procedure that he had developed for brewing in his larger, more industrial scale brewery. And in fact, and this is so cool, he's got, in 1851, this is when the book was written, of course, this would have been installed 10, 20 years earlier, he's actually got horizontal metal pressurized, mechanically stirred, steam-heated boilers to pre-boil the wheat and the raw grains. So he's actually got they're long, horizontal cylinders, maybe 10, 12 feet long, and 3, 4, 5 feet in diameter, that had motorized stirring in them, and they stir the stuff and cook it under pressure. And of course, that's really efficient way to gelatinize wheat. And that's not a world away from, say, a company like Coors that pressure boils. I mean, they do because they're at high altitude. But that's the technique, basically, that large American breweries use to make adjunct beer. And it's a great and that's a classic technique that really makes great wit beer too. Just follow the classic, American adjunct mash procedure works perfectly for making wit beer. And that's I haven't had time to really dig into his process, but from what I've seen of it, that's very much along the lines of what he's doing there. So it's kind of cool to see in fact, that was earlier than that process had been worked out in America by guys like Anton Schwartz and J.E. Siebel. So, or not J.E., the elder Siebel, but in the 1870s is when those American adjunct mashes really started to become a possibility here. So he predated that before. So,
do we see sort of evolutionary procedures that continued after that, or do we see things that the sort of the tree fork stops there and nobody ever uses those anymore? You know what I'm saying? Are there dead ends to the evolutionary track in the brewing process?
Well, there always are. Again, I haven't spent enough time with all of this material, and I don't have any of the outside of the English accounts that were written by guys like G.M. Johnson around 1895 or early 1900s about Belgian brewing. I don't have any other Belgian. It's sort of a big gap in my information. We have a generation or two between 1851 and then the next information I have is 1896. So I'm not sure exactly what was going on in that meantime. One thing that happened in 1822, the Dutch government, which had taken possession of Belgium at that point from the French after the Napoleonic struggles, imposed a taxation system that was based on taxing the capacity of the mash tun. And in addition to having your barley mash tun, you were allowed to have a second mash tun for adjunct grains. And it was only taxed at 2/3 the capacity. But guess what? People filled them up anyway. And so Johnson describes these crazy techniques where people would actually pile up mash so that it was heaped up in the center of these mash tuns. And it's another reason why the Stuckmanns were good. You could fill that up and then you could just jam this down and squeeze stuff out. Now that was taken off in about the 1870s, I believe. And there was quite a bit of chaos around that time because people thought, oh, great, we don't have to use this crazy system anymore. And then they were sort of at a loss. They started brewing on the English system and doing your basic fly sparging, or the Scottish system, which was called at the time, of the just sparging system. And they found that the beers were terrible because, and that's a universal truth about brewing is that recipes are very closely tied to process and ingredients. So you got ingredients, you got process, and you got the actual formulations, and you can't change one and get the same results because that process is so different that if you change the process, you really have to change the recipe drastically, and you really have to look at the ingredients and make sure now that they're not all wrong for this new process. So they had quite a period of chaos. And then when they got into World War I, the average gravity of Belgian beer at the end of World War I was 2 degrees Plato. Right? And that was beets and tapioca and whatever they could find. It wasn't good, clean barley malt. So it's hard to overstate the devastating effect on Belgian beer by World War I because it was not in all that great shape to start with, and then the Germans completely trashed that country. It was much better in World War II. Much trouble as they had in World War II, they didn't just utterly stomp the country into the ground like they did in World War I. It was just brutal on Belgium. So
but in World War I, it was just literally fought in Belgium.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And they took all the metal out of, it took all the copper and brass out of the breweries and replaced it with cast iron, probably not much of that anyway. And, of course, food is a basic resource that the troops get, and that doesn't leave, or the troops' animals or whatever you're needing for it, doesn't leave a lot left to brew beer. So it was pretty dire. So they really had to rebuild it from scratch.
So when do we start seeing the beers that we would be familiar with today as Belgian beers? This plethora of beers.
Two key things. In 1900 or 1901, the Brewers Guild recognized that they were really in a bad way with their beers, and they held a contest to create some export quality beers. And the deal was you were supposed to publish your recipe, enter the beer, we'd award some prizes, and then we'd have some great beers. People could share information. Well, they weren't so much into sharing then, and so they decided that okay, you can keep your recipe secret, and then they did it the next year, and they got 75 recipes or something like that. And out of that actually came Palm Special was a beer that was formulated out of that recipe contest, and a few others like Ginder Ale and Op Ale and Horse Ale, brands that we don't know well here, but they still exist in Belgium. And so there's a number of those products still on the market that were actually created during that period of time. And again, it was an attempt to displace English beers and German beers. And if you look at a double or a triple or a lot of these strong Belgian beers, they really have a lot more in common with a Doppelbock or a strong English ale or a Burton ale or an IPA or a Scotch ale. Of course, they still love their Scotch ales over there. So those beers are really much more influenced. They're all malt beers or malt plus sugar. They were not beers that had a lot of wheat in them, and they really had very little to do with Belgian brewing traditions. The other thing to remember is that during the French Revolution in 1789, all monasteries were shut, because Belgium was part of France at that time. It was a colony or a province, or not a province, but it was under the government of France. And so what happened in France happened in Belgium as well. So every monastery was shut down. The earliest monastery that opened up after the Revolution was over, after Napoleon left and the Dutch were back in, was 1830 or 31. And so we have a whole generation now from 1789 to 1830. That's 42 years. Nobody's there. Right. Everything's gone. So they had to rebuild them from scratch. And the earliest one didn't even start brewing beer at all until I think it was about 1863, and that was, I believe, Westmalle. And they didn't begin selling to the public till I think it was the 1890s. And really, in terms of commercial products that have some semblance to what we know today, it was the 20s and 30s. Chimay started in the 20s, I believe. Orval was an ancient monastery, but it had been abandoned in the 16th century or something. It had been gone a long, long time, and it was rebuilt from almost ground up in the 1930s. And they've started brewing in the 30s. That's why their packaging has this great Art Deco feel, because that was outright in that era, right? Westmalle Triple was the first modern triple, and that was in 1931. That was the first pale Belgian beer. And, of course, all those triples had a lot to do with pale ales and pilsners, and so those things influenced each other. And the one other key piece of information was that in 1919, the Belgian government forbade the on-premise sale of gin. So now you have a whole class of customers in bars that have been used to drinking strong gin. And the brewers are there with 2-3% alcohol beers. Okay, now what are we going to do? And so somebody realized, hey, you know what? If we make a beer that's 10% alcohol, maybe these gin guys will go for it. And, I may be oversimplifying the story, but that seems to have had a role to play in that.
So, again, government regulation shaping the brewing industry.
You cannot underestimate the importance of that. In the law code of Hammurabi that we all learned about in high school, that steel of stone chiseled in, ancient. It wasn't Sumeria; it was the next civilization, I believe. But they have. There's a beer law in there, and it specifies about how payment is to be made for beer, and specifies a punishment. So it's basically, regulating the tavern trade and the way beer is bought and sold, all the way back in that. So you can't underestimate the influence. Still going on. We're still fighting battles between spirits, between these different things. In fact, there's a regulation going into effect in California very shortly that may have some dire impact in terms of barrel-aged beers that have had whiskey in them before, because this government's not really even open to review. This governmental agency has just decreed that anything with 0.5% of alcohol derived from spirits will be taxed at the spirits rate, which is about, I think it's something like $3.50 a gallon, as opposed to beer, which is taxed at like 30 cents a gallon. So it's a tenfold increase in the tax. It's quite silly, but we're still fighting those battles.
So you said you haven't gotten into lambics yet, but what was the method of fermentation for these beers that you're playing with? Were they spontaneously fermented, or? No,
not so much. There were a couple that have some similarities to lambics. There was one of the styles, I forget which one, was actually had that same system that lambic had for generations, where the brewers brewed the wort, and some of them fermented it, but also a lot of the wort was sold unfermented and was sold directly to what you would call in the wine business negociants, who would take the wort or the just barely fermenting beer and take it back to their place and put it in barrels and allow it to ferment and age and then blend beers out of this rack of aging beers that would give you your consistent house character. I believe Girardin was still doing that. I'm not sure. I know most of the people who were doing it 10 or 20 years ago are no longer doing it that way. I think maybe, I'm not sure, but maybe even still today, Girardin and Drie-Fonteinen were certainly blenders first, and I think Drie-Fonteinen has been brewing. I'm not sure about the other one, but that was the way that was done. So certainly there was some sourness. He does talk about sourness. You ferment in wood, you're going to get sour. Most of the beers came in two strengths, an ordinary and a double. And double just simply meant stronger, but and even the strongest beer in the book, I think, is only about 1070, which would give you 7% alcohol or thereabouts. Most of the doubles are somewhere we would consider a normal table beer today, about 5%, 5.5%, maybe possibly 6%. So not super strong. And the weak beers were brewed to 2% alcohol. Oh, one other tidbit he does clarify about Saison. Now, there's no beer in that. The only beer in that book from Saison is from all the way over on the Dutch-speaking province, I think from Limburg, on the east side of, actually the German-inflected province of over in Limburg. And it has very little to do with the modern Saisons, so it's a little unclear where those Saisons come from, but it's always sort of bugged me. People say, well, it's Saison because we drink it in the summer, and summer is a Saison, it's a season, it just means season, and that's one of those very unsatisfying origins, that you listen to it, you think, that's probably not true. And so what was great to see in one of these chapters where he talks about Saison, and not as a beer style, but just as simply as a term to denote one of these doubles or stronger beers, because those were only brewed in season, and meaning that those were only brewed between late fall and early spring. And because that was a cold season, the cool season, and obviously in Germany and not so much in England, but Germany and the rest of Europe, you're only allowed to brew serious beers in the winter. Summer beers, weak beers, you could brew all summer long because you brew them, they're light, they're weak, they don't last. If you want beer in the summer, you have to have that. So it's not about like appropriateness for the season. It's really about the brewing of them. So when a beer was described as en saison, that means it was a proper full strength beer that was brewed between October and March, basically. So interesting to have. It's funny. You have these little nagging questions, and then you get this book. You just like one little sentence. It's like, of course, it makes so much sense. So.
It's the Rosetta Stone.
It's not actually. It's just a giant game of connect the dots. I wish we had a Rosetta Stone. You just have these data points. This is a huge, giant bucket of data points, but still, it's not everything. There's a lot of pieces missing. And he's francophone, so there's I'm sure some Dutch, Flemish stuff that he doesn't cover. And there's even a few styles. He says, I admit I'm not an expert in this style, and I talk to people, and so there's still a lot we don't know. It's going to continue that way, but that makes it fun. So,
yeah. So is there going to be a book from you based on this book, interpreting the styles, interpreting the text?
That's hard to picture right now. I mean, it's such a geeky thing. It's such a subculture. I just hope to stir up a little hubbub and get a bunch of people brewing them, certainly get them thinking about Belgium a little bit differently. I hope maybe some Belgian brewers take notice of it and decide to kind of dredge up a little of their history in ways that they haven't done. I mean, that they're drenched in history already. But, who knows? A little more history, a little different story is always interesting to people. So certainly it will find its way into Zymergy. And I'll have some information posted after the conference here, pretty rough information, but it's the recipes and some of beers that were brewed and some things like that. So I'll be doing something with it.
Yeah, I know. The first question that people are getting ready to type into their computer right now is, how can I get a hold of these recipes, and how can I play with these beers?
Well, I will try and make something available. I don't want to release really lousy stuff to too wide an audience. So I want to make sure that it's right. If somebody's just out of control with desire to brew one of those things, they can get a hold of me on radicalbrewing.com, and I'd be happy to forward along my really messy giant document on LeCombre, and they can have at it. So.
Well, it's fascinating stuff, and I look forward to trying the beers on Saturday.
Yeah.
Thanks, Randy.
Thank you so much.
Man, what a fun chat. Thanks again to Randy Mosher for taking time out to talk to us. Now, I've emailed Randy for the recipes of those Belgian beers, and I'm hoping that he'll let me post them on basicbrewingradio.com, or at least post a link to them on basicbrewingradio.com. So check the description of this episode in the next few days to see if they're there. Otherwise, do what he says and shoot Randy an email through his site, Radical Brewing. I'd like to get on a hold of those myself. I'd like to try one or two of those. If you have brewing questions, show suggestions, or just want to say howdy, write to james@basicbrewing.com, or just fill out the contact form on basicbrewing.com, and please don't forget to tell us where you're from, and check your email address. And you can check out our low-tech lagering and decoction mashing DVD on basicbrewingshop.com, where you can see Steve do a single-step decoction mash, and you can follow me through a lager fermentation in the middle of summer, where I don't use a dedicated chest freezer. There are also our original DVDs and Basic Brewing Introduction to Extract Home Brewing. We walk you through the extract brewing process, step by step, from boiling to bottling. And in Basic Brewing Stepping into All Grain, we take you through the all grain process from milling your grain to collecting your wort. And you can find combo deals to save a few bucks on our store if you want to buy more than one DVD at a time. You can also see a listing of the fine folks across the country who sell our DVDs on basicbrewing.com. And if there isn't a vendor in your area, you can order it online in our online shop, as I said before, at basicbrewingshop.com. Got shirts and hats, including our ever-popular Go Forth and Flocculate shirt. And thanks to everybody also who's continued to click on our Amazon.com Associates link. We appreciate the support there. Our featured products this week that were purchased through the link are Scanning Probe Microscopy and Spectroscopy, Theory, Techniques, and Applications. That's quite the book. And on the other hand, Who Needs Donuts would be the opposite end of the book spectrum there, I guess. Thanks again, and remember, I can't tell who bought what, so no worries. Just click on the Amazon.com logo on our site the next time you feel like Amazon shopping, and we appreciate your support. Continues to amaze me how many people are going through that. It's really cool. And I've also added some other associate links on there under the Amazon thing that you might want to check out. One is a company that makes humorous shirts. It's called Torso Pants. We've also got the StarWarsShop.com. You know, people occasionally order Star Wars stuff through Amazon. So, and also Pinatas.com. So it's a little something for everybody. I don't know why I put Pinatas.com on there, but you know, costume time's coming up, and you never know when you might need a piñata as well. So check those out. And let me know if you do business with the Torso Pants or the Star Wars Shop or whoever that you do business with through the links. I'm very familiar with Amazon, as is everybody. So, but these new people that if you click on any of the new people and buy stuff on there, let me know how they do, because I don't want to recommend stuff that's not good. So let me know, good or bad, how they do. Okay, that's it. The fourth year starting off with a bang. What if they have like a beer-shaped piñata? We need to get one. Surely they do. That's all till next week. Until then, thanks for listening. I'm James Spencer. Production help for Basic Brewing Radio, and our website is provided by Kelly Dodson, our buddy in Austin. Basic Brewing Radio is a production of Active Voicing. We'll talk to you next time, everybody. So long.